There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a working ranch at 4 in the morning, not peaceful, not restful, but watchful. Like the land itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what you'll do next. I've spent 31 years in that quiet. I've watched men walk away from it, good men, proud men, because the land asked too much and gave back too little. I've seen droughts turn a man's savings to dust in a single August. I've seen winter storms take cattle that 3 generations of one family had bled to build. I've seen the kind of heartbreak that doesn't make noise, that just settles into a man's spine and stays there. But I have never, not once in 31 years, seen anything like what Marguerite Coldwater did with 15 mules that every soul in Perdition County had already buried in their minds. I almost didn't write this down. I keep a field log, have since I was 22, a habit my father called obsessive and my wife called endearing. Mileage, weather, water sources, the particular stubbornness of certain fence posts, the kind of record-keeping that makes practical sense and lets me pretend I'm in control of something. I've got 41 spiral notebooks lined up in my tack room, and I've never once written a story in them, just facts, just numbers. This one earned words, because what happened on that old trail, the Canyon Largo cut-through that nobody had used commercially since 1987, that the county maps don't even bother to mark anymore. It changed something in me that I didn't know needed changing. And I've been trying to figure out how to explain that without sounding like a man who's gone soft in his 60s. Maybe I have gone soft, maybe that's not the worst thing. But you need to understand where it started. You need to understand about the mules, who they were before Marguerite, what they looked like, what they meant to the people who'd given up on them. Because the trail part, the impossible thing she pulled off in October, none of it makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning was ugly. The first time I saw one of Marguerite Coldwater's mules, it was standing in the middle of Route 9 at 7:15 in the morning, blocking traffic in both directions, with a look on its face that I can only describe as philosophically committed to not moving. That was Hector. He was a 17-year-old John mule, gray along his muzzle and down his legs, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw that nobody could fully account for. The auction house in Taos had sold him 3 times in 4 years. Each time the new owner brought him back within 6 months. The last one a livestock broker named Fenwick, who I'd never particularly liked, wrote in his return paperwork. Dangerous, unworkable, recommend euthanasia. I was the one who found him on Route 9 that Tuesday morning. I'd pulled over to log my mileage before making the turn toward my east pasture, and there he was standing dead center in the asphalt, ears flat, eyes narrowed at the line of 3 pickup trucks that had stopped short of him. Nobody was getting out. Nobody wanted to approach a mule with Hector's reputation. I got out. I walked up slow, hands low, the way you do. He watched me come. His ribs showed through his coat, but he wasn't skinny the way a neglected animal goes skinny. He was lean the way an old fighter goes lean, stripped of everything unnecessary. His eyes were amber, and they had that particular quality I've come to recognize in animals that have been failed by humans so many times they've developed a considered position on the matter. He let me get close enough to take hold of his halter, a cracked leather thing that didn't fit right, tilted back on his skull. And then he planted his feet and stood there, immovable as geology, while I stood in the road feeling mildly ridiculous. He won't go with you. The voice came from the shoulder. I turned and saw a woman I didn't recognize, mid-50s, sitting on the cab roof of a battered white truck like that was a perfectly ordinary place to be. She had dark hair shot through with silver, pulled back in a braid that had mostly come undone, and she was eating an apple with the focused attention of someone who wasn't remotely troubled by the situation. I can see that, I said. He's been out here for 40 minutes. I've been waiting. Waiting for what? She took another bite of the apple. For him to decide. I looked at the mule, I looked at her. Decide what? Where he wants to go. She slid off the cab roof, landed easy, and walked toward us. She was shorter than I expected, 5'3" maybe, and she moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who'd stopped needing to prove anything a long time ago. She stopped a few feet from Hector and didn't reach for him. She just stood there. He looked at her, she looked at him. After about 45 seconds, he took a step toward her. There, she said quietly, not triumphant, just noting it. That was my introduction to Marguerite Coldwater. I learned the fuller picture over the weeks that followed, piecemeal, the way you learn anything in a place like Perdition County, through conversation at the feed store, through my wife Alina's contacts at the county extension office, through the particular efficiency of small-town gossip that I'd spent decades pretending to be above. Marguerite had bought the old Herrera place 8 miles east of Truches in late spring. 60 acres of mixed terrain, a house that needed serious work, a barn that needed more work, and a reputation for being either ambitious or delusional depending on who you asked. She'd come from somewhere in the Colorado high country, Auray, I thought I heard, though nobody confirmed it, and she had no family that anyone knew of and no immediately obvious plan, which made her an object of low-grade suspicious fascination for most of the people in a 30-mile radius. The mules started arriving in June. First 2 came from an estate sale in Santa Fe, part of a working pack string that had dissolved when the outfitter who owned them died without heirs, and the business had to liquidate. Then 3 from a BLM holding facility south of Albuquerque, animals that had been wild-caught and couldn't be successfully gentled through the standard process. Then a pair from a woman in Espanola who'd taken them in from a film production company that had used them for a period western, and then found them inconvenient. Then Hector, who by then was officially designated as unadoptable by the rescue network that had been passing him around. By July she had 11, by the end of August 15. Not one of them was easy. Not one of them had what anyone in the animal trade would call a clean history. There was Rosamund, a Molly mule who'd been used as a pack animal on backcountry trips until she'd thrown a fully loaded pack mid-trail and turned around and walked 17 miles back to the trailhead alone, a feat that earned her a reputation for being untrustworthy, despite the fact that, as Marguerite pointed out when I heard her say it to someone at the feed store one afternoon, the pack had been improperly loaded, and Rosamund had simply made a sensible decision. There was a young male they called Ignacio, not yet 5, still reactive and occasionally explosive, who'd been sold from owner to owner since he was weaned, and had developed the kind of hypervigilance that makes an animal unpredictable in the way that really frightened people. There was an older pair, a gray Jenny and a darker John, that I never heard called by individual names. They seemed to function as a unit, always within sight of each other, and they had a shared habit of positioning themselves between whatever they considered a threat and the other mules in the group, which was admirable but made working with either of them individually almost impossible. And there was the mule I thought of privately as the senator, a huge, dignified sorrel John with an enormous head and an expression of permanent mild disapproval, who'd been a prize winner in his youth, and had then spent a decade in a situation that I'll just describe as inadequate and leave it at that. He had a vertical scar on his right foreleg and a horizontal one near his hip, and he moved with the deliberate care of an animal that had learned that pain comes suddenly and without warning, and you should be prepared. I want to be honest about something. My first instinct watching all of this accumulate was skepticism. I've worked with mules my whole life. My father worked with mules. I grew up on the idea that a mule's intelligence is both its greatest asset and the reason you need to know what you're doing. Because an animal that is genuinely capable of evaluating a situation and making a decision is not going to give you automatic compliance just because you've decided it should. You earn a mule's cooperation. You don't demand it. But 15 of them, 15, with this particular collection of histories and damage and established mistrust, felt like something beyond the reach of what one person could reasonably accomplish. And the chatter in the county ranged from gentle doubt to active prediction of disaster. Old Clarence Bustamante, who runs the alfalfa operation off the Chimyo Road, put it most directly when I ran into him at the co-op in late August. "She's building herself a collection of animals that are going to injure her or kill her," he said, not unkindly. "I've seen people take in one problem animal and it goes sideways. She's got 15. I didn't disagree with him, not then. But I kept watching. What I was watching for, though I didn't frame it that way at the time, was whether Marguerite Coldwater knew what she was doing. Whether she had a system, a method, something beyond the idealism of a person who'd never been seriously hurt by an animal. What I found in the fragments I caught from the road when I was passing, from what she'd say at the feed store, from the one afternoon she invited me in to look at a fence question she wanted a second opinion on, was harder to categorize than a system. She worked with each mule individually, which was obvious and necessary, but what was less obvious was the sequence. She didn't start with the easiest ones. She didn't work down a hierarchy of tractability. She started with the mule that was most afraid. Fear compounds, she told me that afternoon, walking her fence line while I tagged along and tried to be useful. If the frightened ones are watching, the confident ones get worked and everything looks manageable. That's different than the frightened ones watching each other reinforce the fear. You work with the scared one first and the rest of them are watching. They see that nothing terrible happens. They learn something. I asked her how she learned that. She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thoughtful. She had that quality, the ability to not fill silence just because it existed. I made a lot of mistakes with animals I loved, she said finally, and I paid attention to the mistakes. That was the most she said about herself that day. But I noticed something as we walked. The mules in the field moved around us differently than I expected. Not all of them. Ignacio kept his distance, and the unnamed pair watched from the far fence with their particular vigilant attention. But several of them drifted closer as Marguerite walked the fence line. Not obviously, not dramatically. Just a gradual, casual drift that looked more like curiosity than affection, more like professional respect than dependence. Hector followed about 20 feet behind us for the entire length of the fence line, never getting closer, never falling back. It was like watching someone who'd learned a language that most people had decided wasn't worth the difficulty of learning. I didn't write it in my field log that night. It didn't fit any of my categories. September came in dry and hot, the way New Mexico September does when it's being unkind, and I had my own problems to manage. A section of pipe in my north irrigation system that had started failing, a hay supplier who was suddenly unreliable, the particular low-grade anxiety that accumulates when you're running a small operation in a year when everything costs more and the margin is already thin. I saw Marguerite twice in September, once at the post office, once passing each other on the county road. Both times she looked like someone who was working more than sleeping, with the particular quality of tiredness that isn't quite exhaustion. It's the kind that comes from being fully inhabited by what you're doing, from not having enough mental space left over to perform normal social ease. I didn't know then that she was planning something. Elena found out first through the Extension Office network, specifically through a county agricultural liaison named Portia Medina, who was responsible for the trail use permits in our section of the county. Marguerite had filed a request in mid-September to run a commercial pack string through the Canyon Largo cut-through. 10 miles of unmaintained trail through rocky, narrow terrain with 3 significant elevation changes and a creek crossing that flooded irregularly. The trail had last been used commercially in 1987 by a hunting outfitter who'd stopped using it after losing 2 pack horses to alleged failure on the north section. The permit request was technically approvable. The county had no prohibition on the use, just the maintenance liability waiver that anyone using an unmaintained trail had to sign. But Portia had called the extension office to ask if anyone knew this Coldwater woman, because the permit request listed the animal count as 15 mules. 15 mules? All of them? Elena told me over dinner, and I put down my fork and sat with it for a moment. What's she carrying? I asked. The permit lists it as a demonstration run. No cargo for hire. She's applying for commercial pack certification, which requires a documented trail completion. I thought about that. I thought about each of the 15 animals I'd been watching accumulate on that 60-acre property. I thought about Ignacio's reactive edges, about the unnamed pair's guarding behavior, about the senator's slow, considered movement on uneven ground. That trail hasn't been cleared in 30 years, I said. I know. Sections of it aren't even fully walkable. There were downed trees across it as of 5 years ago when I went through on foot. I know. We sat with that for a while. She knows what she's doing? Elena asked. She wasn't asking me to reassure her. She was asking my genuine read. I thought about Hector following 20 feet behind on the fence line. I thought about what Marguerite had said about the frightened ones watching. I don't know, I said, which was honest. I think she might. I also think what she's planning is genuinely hard. What I didn't say was that I was going to be there for it. I wrote that in my field log that night. First personal entry I'd made in 41 notebooks. October 3rd. Coldwater plans the Canyon Largo run. All 15, I should go, I don't know why exactly, writing it down anyway. The 2 weeks before the run were a particular kind of tension. Marguerite didn't advertise it widely, but word spread anyway, the way things do, and the county's collective opinion ranged across a wide band. Some people were rooting for her in the cautious way you root for someone attempting something you privately think is too hard. Some were certain it would end in a vet call or worse. Clarence Bustamante stopped me at the co-op to say he'd heard about it, and to tell me, with the particular weight of a man who's seen a lot of things go wrong, that he hoped she had adequate liability coverage. I found myself defending her, not arguing, just noting to several people that she wasn't reckless, that she'd been methodical, that the animals were in better condition than they'd been when they arrived. All of which was true, and none of which fully addressed the core concern, which was that 15 individually difficult mules plus 30-year-old unmaintained terrain was a combination that didn't have an obvious good outcome. But something else was happening in those 2 weeks that I only understood later. Marguerite was doing something with the animals that looked, from the road, like extended trail walking in her east pasture, back and forth over the same rough section of ground near the arroyo, with the whole group of 15 together. Not riding, not packing. Just walking them through rough terrain as a unit, letting them figure out the group rhythm, letting the ones who needed to see the others navigate a step down or a loose footing watch it happen before they had to do it themselves. The frightened ones watching, the learning she described. She was teaching them to be 15 together, not just 15 individuals. I didn't fully understand that until I was on the trail. I almost didn't get to go. That's the thing I think about now when I go back through it. How close I came to just watching from a distance, to being someone who heard about it secondhand and filed it under interesting thing that happened. 3 days before the run, Alina's sister broke her wrist in a fall, and Alina had to drive down to Las Cruces to help, which meant the north irrigation issue and the hay situation and a half-dozen other operational fragments landed entirely on me for the week. I spent 2 days doing the math on whether I could be away from the property for a full day and concluded reluctantly that the answer was no. And then Marguerite knocked on my door at 7 in the morning on October 6th, 1 day before the run, and asked if I'd come. Not as help, that's what I want to be clear about because I think I initially understood it wrong. She wasn't asking for assistance. She wasn't short-handed or uncertain. She had 2 people already committed. A young man named Dario who worked for her part-time and had been on the property since July, and an older woman named Sylvie who I gathered was a friend from her Colorado years. Lean and weathered and clearly competent in the specific way that comes from decades of backcountry work. She was asking me to come because she thought I should see it. "You've been watching," she said, standing on my porch with her coffee cup and that slightly loosened braid. "You should finish watching." I stared at her. "How do you know I've been watching?" She smiled, not unkindly. "Because when I walk the fence on the east side, you slow down on the county road every time." Which was, I had to admit, accurate. I made 3 calls, arranged for my neighbor Gustavo's boy to check the irrigation twice during the day, and told myself this was a reasonable use of my time. I wrote in my log before I left, October 7th, "Going, don't know what I expect to see." We met at the Canyon Largo trailhead at 5:45 in the morning, which is before dawn in early October in northern New Mexico. The air carrying that specific high-desert cold that gets into your lungs and makes everything feel clarified and slightly unforgiving. The mules were already loaded and ready. Not packed, no cargo except water and a small kit each for the 3 humans. Just haltered, lead ropes clipped, standing in the staging area in that particular mule patience that isn't quite calm and isn't quite restless, but is something more complex than either. I stood at the edge of the group with my field log in my jacket pocket, the automatic comfort of it, and I took count. 15, all 15. Hector was at the front, which surprised me. I'd expected him to be worked into the middle of the string somewhere. The established lead position tends to go to the most confident animal, the one whose body language sets the tone. Hector was old and scarred and had a documented history of planting himself in public roads and refusing to move. He was not the obvious choice. I walked over to Marguerite, who was checking the cinch on Rosamund's halter with the focused attention of someone running a final systems check. "Why Hector first?" I asked. She didn't look up right away. "Because the others are looking at him," she said. "They've been looking at him since June. He's got," she searched for the word, "standing with them. They watch what he does." He's not exactly known for being reliable, I said, and regretted it immediately. It sounded more dismissive than I intended. She looked up then, not offended, considering. He's known for not doing things he doesn't trust, she said. That's not the same thing. I thought about that the whole first mile. The Canyon Largo cut-through begins as a fire road, wide enough for a vehicle, gravel-packed, unremarkable, for the first 3/4 of a mile. Then it drops into the actual canyon approach, where it becomes something that was once a maintained trail and is now a maintained memory of a trail, the actual path recoverable if you know what you're looking for but not obvious if you don't. Marguerite knew what she was looking for. She'd walked it 3 times alone in September. I learned this from Dario, who was walking beside me in the 2nd mile, a quiet young man who had that particular characteristic of people who are genuinely interested in what's happening and not very interested in talking about anything else. He was 23, from Chimyo originally, and he'd come to work for Marguerite after his uncle, who was a mule packer, had suggested it. She walked the whole trail? I asked. 3 times, he said. Last time she brought Hector. Just Hector. Just Hector, he paused. He balked at the 3rd crossing. She waited him out for 2 hours. I thought about the patience required for that, for sitting with an animal in an uncomfortable place for 2 hours without forcing the issue, just letting the decision develop. Did he cross? Eventually. What changed his mind? Dario glanced at me sideways. She sat down, he said. She'd been standing. And then she sat down in the trail and pulled out her lunch, and he walked across and came and stood next to her. I didn't say anything for a bit. She told him about the trail, Dario added. I know that sounds, he shrugged, but she talks to them, not the way people talk to dogs, different, like she's narrating something. I wrote that in my field log that night when I had the presence of mind to write again. She narrates, like they're following a story together and she's telling them the next part. The first significant obstacle was a section at mile 4 where a dead juniper, enormous, decades old, had fallen across the path at chest height, and the trail below it had eroded in a way that made the footing uncertain. There was a workaround, a wide deviation through the scrub that avoided the log, but it was loose ground with a sharp drop on the left side, maybe 8 feet down into a dry wash. Marguerite stopped the string before it. We stood there, all 3 humans, 15 mules, in the particular silence of a canyon that doesn't carry sound the way open ground does, and she looked at the obstacle for a long time. Then she walked the deviation herself, slowly, arms slightly out, testing each step. Then she came back and walked it again. Dario, she said, not loud. Yeah. Take the tail end, hold anyone who needs holding. She looked at Sylvie. You with me on Hector. Hector was watching her. I've tried to describe this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm overreading an animal's expressions, but he was watching her with a quality of attention that I don't know how else to name except as investment. Like he was gathering information. Like the next 5 minutes mattered to him, and he was doing the cognitive work of preparing for them. She walked to him, put her hand on his neck, and said something close to his ear. I was 10 feet away and couldn't hear it. Then she started the deviation. He followed. Not immediately. There was a pause, 2 or 3 seconds, where his weight shifted and his head came up and his ears moved through their small, complicated language. And then he moved. The 8-foot drop on the left side meant that the animals' bodies were canted slightly right, which on uncertain footing is uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and the kind of thing that sends some animals into refusal. Hector navigated it with the deliberate carefulness of the senator's movement that I'd noticed months earlier, that quality of an animal that has learned to treat each step as something worth deciding. He moved across the deviation in about 40 seconds. Then he stopped on the far side and turned his head back. That's the thing I've thought about the most since then, that turn. Because the 14 mules behind him were watching, and when he turned back and looked at them, something shifted in the group. I can't quantify it. I'm not someone who deals in unquantifiable things, generally, but it was visible. The quality of attention in the string changed. Rosamund went second. She had one bad moment on the slope, her right rear slipped and she lurched, and my stomach dropped, but she recovered and she went across. Then Ignacio. Ignacio was the one I'd been most anxious about, in the way that I'd been cataloging anxieties since 5:45 in the morning. He was young and reactive, and the deviation was exactly the kind of uncontrolled sensory situation that had sent him into explosiveness before. I'd seen it twice at the property. Once when a piece of loose tin had banged against the barn roof in the wind, once when a dog had appeared unexpectedly on the road. He came to the deviation and stopped. Hard stop, weight back, head up. His whole body was doing the rapid computation that animals do, the threat assessment. Dario behind him didn't push. Sylvie ahead didn't pull. They just held the space, waited. Hector on the far side made a sound. Not a bray, a lower sound, a rumble, the kind of vocalization mules make when they're communicating something specific rather than just expressing a state. Ignacio took a step. Then another. He went across in 15 seconds, which felt like 15 minutes, and when he cleared the far side and found himself next to Hector, he pressed his head briefly against the older mule's neck in a gesture that I found, despite my best efforts at professional detachment, affecting. I went last, climbing over the fallen juniper with less grace than any of the 15 mules had managed. Miles 5 through 7 were the body of the difficulty. The trail through the canyon's middle section was overgrown, narrow, and ran through 3 wet draws where the footing changed from rock to clay to loose sand inside of 20 steps. The elevation rose and fell unevenly, with short, steep climbs that required the animals to push hard, and then plateaus that were almost deceptively easy before the next drop. We moved slowly. Marguerite didn't push the pace. She let the string set its own rhythm, which was longer and more deliberate than you'd use on a known trail. Each animal reading the animal ahead, adjusting, the whole group breathing and moving with the particular synchrony that develops when 15 individual systems find a shared frequency. I found myself walking behind the senator who was near the middle of the string. His movement was what I watched for that section, because if any animal was going to struggle with the sustained physical demand, I thought it was him. His right foreleg with the vertical scar, the hip, an older animal with accumulated physical history on technical terrain. He moved beautifully. Not easily, you could see the work of it, the conscious placement of each foot, the slight pause before a steep downstep, but beautifully in the sense that there was no wasted movement, no unnecessary tension. He had, over years of difficult experience, learned to be exactly where he was, doing exactly what the terrain required without anything extra. I thought of Marguerite's phrase, I made a lot of mistakes with animals I loved, and I paid attention to the mistakes. The senator had done the same. He'd paid attention. The creek crossing at mile 7 was where we lost an hour. Not to disaster, not to injury, to a circumstance that took time and patience and an approach I wouldn't have thought of. The unnamed pair, the gray Jenny and the darker John, the ones who'd never fully separated, who'd spent months on the property as a unit, would not cross separately. The trail protocol required single file on the crossing, which was rocky and uneven and only wide enough for one animal at a time, and the gray Jenny reached the bank and stopped and would not go without the darker John, and the darker John, behind her, couldn't go yet because she was blocking the crossing. Marguerite stood at the bank for a while. I could see her working through it, not panicking, not forcing, just thinking. Then she made a decision that I've turned over many times since. She moved the darker John to the front. Walked him up past the Jenny, past 3 other mules in the string, and positioned him at the crossing. They were facing the same direction now, him at the front of the crossing, her behind it, and between them the water. She led the John across first. The Jenny watched from the bank. Her ears tracked him the entire way. When he reached the far side and turned, the same gesture Hector had made at the deviation, that backward look, she crossed immediately. 20 seconds, not a moment's hesitation. They'd needed to see each other, not be beside each other, see each other across the distance with a crossing between them. I've thought about that as a principle for things beyond mules. I've tried not to turn it into a simplistic metaphor and mostly failed. The last 2 miles were, in some ways, the hardest. Not because of terrain, the trail opened up after mile 8 into wider ground with better footing and clearer passage. They were harder because exhaustion sets in with mules the same way it sets in with people, not as collapse, but as reduced tolerance. Things that were manageable at mile 4 become edges at mile 9. Small frictions accumulate. Ignacio went through a rough patch in mile 8 that I watched Dario handle with a steadiness I respected. The young mule had hit a wall of reactive fatigue, not explosive, but twitchy, ears working overtime, responding to small sounds in the scrub. Dario stayed close, didn't crowd him, didn't back off. Just maintained the particular quality of consistent, unconcerned presence that tells an anxious animal that the person with them is not alarmed. And if the person with them is not alarmed, perhaps there is no alarm to be had. It took about a quarter mile. Ignacio came back down, his ears settled, his stride re-lengthened. Rosamund developed a slight hitch in her walk at mile 9 that Marguerite noticed from the front of the string and addressed by stopping the whole group, walking back, spending 4 minutes doing something with the fit of Rosamund's halter, and checking her near foreleg with careful hands. The hitch disappeared when they resumed. What she'd found, I learned later, was a small burr embedded in the halter strap that had been creating a contact irritation. 4 minutes of attention, problem resolved. Hector at the front didn't vary his pace significantly for the entire 10 miles. He was the metronome, the thing that stayed constant when everything else was shifting. I have a page in my field log from that day that I wrote during a 10-minute water stop at mile 8, and it says, "Hector is why this is possible. Not because he's the best mule, he probably isn't. Because he's the most decided one. Because the others believe what he believes about the situation, trust as terrain feature." That last is very like me. I hadn't figured out what I was trying to say. I still haven't fully. There's a point in the last half mile of the Canyon Largo cut-through where the trail rounds a long curve, and the canyon opens south, and you can see the Sangre de Cristos laid out across the middle distance. The mountains going blue and then purple in the afternoon light, and the open rangeland below them catching the angle of the October sun in a way that makes the dry grass look like it's been lit from underneath. I've driven past the end of that trail dozens of times in my life. I've never seen that view from the inside of it. We came around that curve at 3:45 in the afternoon, 8 hours after we'd started, and the view opened up, and the 15 mules, who had been moving in their established string order with the focused attention of animals completing a task, slowed, and then stopped. Not to rest, not to bulk, something else. Hector was first. He stopped and lifted his head and looked south, the way horses and mules look at open country sometimes, with an attention that is different from vigilance, not scanning for threat, just taking it in. Then the others, one by one down the string, pausing, heads lifting, ears forward, the senator, Rosamund. The unnamed pair, side by side now that the single-file constraint was lifted, both of them looking at the same middle distance. Ignacio, who had been twitchy and vigilant for 9.5 miles, stood still and simply looked. Sylvie made a sound beside me, quiet, involuntary, the kind of sound that means I was not prepared for this. Marguerite stood at the front with Hector and didn't say anything. She'd brought these 15 animals through 10 miles of terrain that everyone had decided they couldn't handle, with no losses, no injuries, no crisis beyond what patience and attention had resolved. She'd done the thing she'd been planning to do. She didn't look victorious. That's the word I keep reaching for when I try to describe her expression at that moment and then setting aside. She didn't look victorious. She looked like someone who'd kept a promise. We made camp at the southern trailhead. Not because we'd planned to. The original plan was a vehicle retrieval. But Dario's truck, which had been staged at the south end, had a flat that turned out to be a slow leak that had gone fully flat in the 8 hours we'd been on the trail. And Sylvie's spare was already in use under her truck's frame in a temporary repair situation. She explained in the kind of shorthand that told me this was not the first time she'd operated in improvised circumstances. So we made camp. Marguerite had a tarp and ground pads in her pack, because Marguerite apparently prepared for contingencies, and Dario had a camp stove and enough food for an extra meal because he had learned, he said simply, to do that when working with her. The mules were hobbled in a loose group in the open ground near the tree line, and they settled into the long, slow business of grazing and resting. Hector and the senator positioned near the perimeter of the group, with the particular alertness that old, experienced animals maintain even in rest. I had my field log. I sat on a flat rock at the edge of the fire Dario had started with the cheerful efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoys building fires, and I tried to write down what I'd seen and found that the categories in my log, mileage, weather, water, terrain, were inadequate for the task. I flipped back through a few pages of the sparse personal entries I'd started making since September. They were tentative. The handwriting a little more compressed than usual, the way my handwriting gets when I'm uncertain about what I'm putting down. Facts about Marguerite's operation presented with the slight defensive neutrality of someone trying to be objective about something they're actually not objective about. I wrote October 7th, end of trail, south side, all 15. And then I sat there for a while without writing anything else. Marguerite came and sat near the fire around the time the light went fully purple over the mountains. She had 2 cups of something and offered me one, which turned out to be an extremely strong black coffee that tasted like it had been planned specifically for the moment after a hard day when you need to feel real. I drank it and said nothing for a while, which she seemed fine with. There was a quality to the silence between us by then that felt earned. Not comfortable exactly, I didn't know her well enough for pure comfort, but the silence of people who have shared something that requires no immediate explanation. Ignacio was visible near the tree line, grazing with the focused attention of a young animal that is genuinely hungry after sustained exertion. Earlier, he'd been standing close to Hector, within 5 feet, which I'd never seen before. The older mule hadn't moved away. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked. "Ignacio." Marguerite looked toward him. "He's already all right," she said. "I mean long-term, as a working animal." She considered this honestly. I appreciated that she didn't jump to reassurance. "I think so," she said. "Today was important for him. He found out that a hard situation doesn't have to mean disaster. She paused. That's the specific thing he needed to find out. Each of them needed to find out something different." "What did Hector need to find out?" She was quiet for a moment, and the fire made small sounds. "Hector needed to find out that he was worth leading again," she said. "He'd been told enough times that he was unreliable, unsafe, not suitable. He'd started to move like he believed it. I thought about him at the front of the string all day. The steadiness, the backward looks at the critical moments. You put him there to change his mind," I said. "I put him there because he was the right choice," she said, and there was a gentle firmness in it. Changing his mind was the same thing as being the right choice. They weren't separate. That's one of the things I've written in my field log at least 3 times since then, trying to understand it fully. They weren't separate. I want to tell you what happened in the next part of that conversation, and then I want to tell you what happened after, because both of them matter and they're connected, but the connection only became visible to me later. I asked her why she'd done it. All of it, not just the trail, but the 15 animals, the Herrera place, the whole project. The question I'd been not quite asking for 4 months. She took a long time with it. Long enough that I thought she might not answer, and I was already composing the mental revision of the question into something less intrusive when she said, "Because I needed something to bring back. I waited. I worked with an outfitter in Colorado for 11 years, she said. Good operation, backcountry trips, hunting camps, trail rides, I loved it. And then she stopped, restarted. There was a trip where we pushed too hard on a return. Whether coming in, the client had a flight to catch, the decision to push instead of camp. And I lost a mule in a rock fall, on a section of trail I'd flagged as marginal 2 seasons earlier and been overruled on." She said it flatly, not without feeling, with the specific flatness of someone who has excavated a story enough times that they've learned to carry it, without putting all its weight down every time they tell it. "I left after that," she said. "Took about 2 years to figure out that leaving hadn't fixed the part that needed fixing, which was that I'd let an animal that was in my care get put on a trail I knew wasn't right for it because the business pressure was pointing that way." She looked at the fire. "I couldn't go back and fix that decision, but I could make a different kind of decision 15 more times." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say, and she didn't seem to be looking for something useful. She was just stating it, putting it where it could be heard. After a while I said, "The mule on the Colorado Trail, what was its name?" She almost smiled, not happy, the other kind. "His name was Madrugan," she said, "which means the one who rises early. He always woke up before dawn and just stood looking at the morning like it owed him something." The fire went down a little. Dario and Sylvie were talking quietly on the other side of it, their conversation a low murmur I couldn't parse. "He'd have liked Hector," she said, and that was the end of it. I slept about 3 hours on the ground pad, which is not enough sleep for a man of 63, but was, under the circumstances, acceptable. I woke to the gray pre-dawn to find the mules still grouped and settled, Hector standing with his head up at the edge of the group, already awake, already watching the morning like it owed him something. The retrieval happened by 8. Sylvie had called her son the night before, and he'd brought a truck and a trailer and the spare tire, and we had the mules loaded and moving before 9. I rode back in Marguerite's truck with my field log on my knee, the way I always have it, and she drove with the quiet focus of someone who is not inclined to make conversation before coffee, which I respected. We passed through Trutches around 9:30, and I noticed people watching the trailer with the kind of attention that tells you word has already moved through a small town faster than vehicles do. A man on the sidewalk outside the hardware store, I recognized him as one of Clarence Bustamante's operation managers, tracked the trailer with a look on his face that I couldn't quite classify. I didn't say anything about it. In the weeks after, things shifted in ways that I've been trying to put in order. Marguerite got the commercial pack certification. The permit documentation had been filed and the trail completion recorded by the county liaison, and the certification came through in 3 weeks. She started taking inquiries almost immediately. Backcountry hunting camp support, which is a reliable market in that part of New Mexico, and a trail naturalist who ran small group educational trips and needed pack support that was experienced with mixed terrain. But that wasn't the shift I'm talking about. Clarence Bustamante came out to her property in early November. I found out about this from his operation manager, who told me with a look that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. Clarence had a 2-year-old mule that had come off a breeding line he'd invested in and had turned out to have a pronounced anxiety response to being worked near other horses, a management problem that his operation couldn't easily accommodate. He'd been considering selling the animal, probably at a loss. He brought it to Marguerite. I don't know exactly what he said when he got there. He's not a man who narrates his thinking aloud. But the 2-year-old stayed, and Clarence came back twice in November to see how it was going, and on the second visit he brought one of his sons, who was 18 and had been expressing interest in the animal side of the operation in a way that Clarence hadn't known how to encourage. Portia Medina at the extension office told me she'd had 4 requests in November and December for information about the commercial pack certification process, from people who cited the Canyon Largo run specifically. 2 of them were existing outfitters looking to expand. 2 were people who'd been considering it and hadn't known the certification pathway. And there was a woman from Peñasco, a name I didn't recognize, who came to Marguerite's property in December with a single mule that had been designated unadoptable by the same rescue network that had been passing Hector around. The woman had seen something, heard something, driven 40 minutes out of her way to knock on a door. I know about this because Marguerite mentioned it to me when I stopped by to return a post-hole digger I'd borrowed, and when she mentioned it, she said it the same way she says most things, plainly, without inflation, like a weather report. Someone brought a mule from Peñasco yesterday. Was it bad? I asked, meaning the animal's situation. Pretty bad, she said. He'll be fine. She said it with the particular certainty of someone whose definition of fine is concrete and achievable and not dependent on everything going right. Fine means workable. Fine means the animal has what it needs to come back to itself. I believed her. I want to be honest about what changed in me, which is harder to describe and which I've been circling around in this account, the way I circle around things I'm not sure how to say directly. I've been a rancher my whole life. It's not a livelihood I chose so much as a livelihood I grew into, the way you grow into the features you're born with. At some point you stop thinking of them as a choice and start thinking of them as a fact. I'm good at it. I know the land, I know the seasons, I know the specific weight of a dry year and the specific relief of a wet one. I know my animals. I run a clean operation. But I have kept meticulous, narrowly factual records for 41 years as a way of managing a particular anxiety, which is the anxiety of a person who knows that things go wrong without warning, and who has decided that if he can track enough variables, he can be prepared for that. The log is control. The log is the illusion of control dressed in the clothes of discipline. What I watched on the Canyon Largo Trail on October 7th was a woman who'd made a catastrophic decision once, who'd spent 2 years being unable to fix it, who had then built the most methodical possible response she could construct, not to control the situation, but to be genuinely present to it. To know each animal she was responsible for well enough to understand what they needed to find out. To make the decision at the creek crossing based on watching, not on protocol. To put Hector at the front because he was the right choice, and to know that he was the right choice because she'd paid attention. The meticulous records weren't the discipline, the attention was. I've been keeping my field log differently since October. Not less, more, but different. The facts are still there. The mileage, the weather, the water, the fence posts, but there are other things in there now. Observations, questions I don't have answers to, things that don't fit categories. Alina noticed it. She didn't say anything for a while. She's patient, which is one of her great qualities and occasionally her method of getting at things sideways. And then one evening in December, she picked up the current notebook and leafed through a few pages and set it back down and said, "You're writing differently." "Yeah," I said. "Good differently or concerning differently?" "I thought about it. I don't know yet," I said. She nodded, which is the thing she does when she's decided that's an honest answer and she can work with it. There's one more thing I want to put down, because it happened, and because it's the specific image I come back to most. In late November, about 6 weeks after the trail run, I was driving the county road past Marguerite's east fence line, the same fence line I'd walked with her, the same stretch I'd been monitoring from my truck for months, and I slowed down, as I apparently always do. The mules were in the east pasture, all 15. The afternoon light was doing that specific late November thing in northern New Mexico, where it comes in flat and warm and makes everything look slightly more than itself. And the mules were distributed across the pasture in their individual arrangements. Some grazing, some standing. The unnamed pair near the center, as always. Rosamund doing something methodical along the fence line. Ignacio was in the east corner of the pasture in the afternoon sun, standing still in the particular way that young animals stand when they've run out of reactive energy and arrived, briefly, at rest. He was not alert. His eyes were soft. His ears were loose. Next to him, close enough to touch, stood Hector. The old gray mule with the scar from his ear to his jaw, who'd been returned 3 times, who'd been declared unreliable and dangerous and unsuitable, who'd stood in the middle of Route 9 with a philosophically committed look, and waited for someone to let him decide something. He wasn't looking at Ignacio. He was looking south toward the mountains, the same direction he'd looked at the end of the trail. I don't know what he was looking at. I've never known with animals what they see when they look at open country like that. Whether it's the same thing I see or something I don't have access to. I stopped the truck. I looked at them for a while. Hector and the young mule in the November sun, both of them standing still. Then I drove on. I wrote in my log that night, the last entry in the 43rd notebook. November 28th. Hector and Ignacio, east pasture, afternoon light, no notes, no numbers, some things you just have to have seen. I've been thinking about what makes a decision different from a mistake. Not in the abstract, in the specific, practical sense of a person standing at a trailhead at 5:45 in the morning with 15 animals that everyone has decided don't have anything left to offer, making a different calculation. I don't know if there's a clear line. I know that Marguerite crossed the Canyon Largo with every animal she went in with, and I know that it mattered, and I know that the mattering spread out from it in directions that I can't fully track from here. The 43rd notebook is in my tack room. The 44th one's already started. Last week I stopped on the county road and watched Hector for a while. He was in the west pasture alone, which was unusual, and he had that philosophically committed stillness that I'd first seen on Route 9. Not lost, not stuck. Just settled in a particular quality of presence. After a few minutes, he looked at my truck. We sat like that for a while, him in the cold morning, me with my hand on the steering wheel. Then he went back to whatever he'd been looking at. I don't know if that means anything. I wrote it down anyway.